Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the September 16th, 2025 web show version, season 6, episode 1 of Ask Us. This Ask Us forum is for the presentation of hot topics and issues in the clinical trials community and ecosystem. And this is the beginning of our 17th year of Ask Us, which was, if you're doing the math, was first established back in 2009. Um, I'm Jean Smart, the host of Ask Us, and with me is our producer, Rishi Sani, Education and Event Coordinator from Clinical Trials BC. Hi, Rishi.
Hi, Jean. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Good afternoon. I just want to acknowledge with respect and humility that our offices are located on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We also acknowledge the diverse First Nations across British Columbia who have inherent rights rooted in the connection to their lands and waters which have never been surrendered. In the spirit of reconciliation, we aim to practice cultural safety, value Indigenous ways of knowing, and respect the rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Pictured here is a photograph that I actually took over the weekend with my wife. For those that are familiar, this is the Sunflower Festival in Richmond. It was actually the last day of the festival, so we were very timely on that we were able to see it. I thought it was a great transition as we say goodbye to summer and move into the colder months of autumn. It was still beautiful to see these resilient sunflowers still out. We live in a beautiful province with amazing natural landscapes and farmlands and great community events like this. So even as we move into colder months, I do hope that everyone will still have a chance to appreciate the nature around them, the community around them, and still get out and get to enjoy these beautiful lands that we get to live, work, and play on. Before we begin, we just wanted to let everyone know that the views and opinions expressed during this episode are those of the individual presenters and may not necessarily be reflective of the views of Michael Smith Health Research BC or Clinical Trials BC. If you are viewing this at a group location, we do ask that everyone please register individually still to receive a link to the recording as well as a post-event survey to request your certificate of attendance after this event. There will be an email sent out by me after. We do ask that any external recording of the event, transcribing and or photography of the materials is not permitted. That is including AI tools as well. This will be monitored in the chat. You will have seen though that this actual episode is being recorded and it could be uploaded to our website and a streaming platform after its conclusion. We do reserve the right to edit the recording. And for those who are not familiar who we are at Clinical Trials BC, we are part of Michael Smith Health Research BC, and we strengthen the clinical trial ecosystem by increasing capacity and capability to conduct clinical trials across the province. We lead and partner on various initiatives to maximize the health, educational, and economic benefits of clinical trials. Our leadership at the national and international levels supports collaborative efforts to build talent and catalyze change to advance clinical trials in BC. Thank you, everyone. I'll just hand it back to you, Jean.
Okay, thanks, Rishi. The title of our Ask Us episode today is Good Environmental Practices, GEPs, for clinical trials and sites. And it's coming. So thank you for sending in your questions. You'll find that most of them have been incorporated into this session, or some of them actually generated more questions in and of themselves. So, what are the impacts of clinical trials on the climate and environment? Clinical trials, like many large-scale scientific and medical activities, have an environmental footprint that contributes to a broader issues, sustainability challenges. Today, we're talking about the environmental impact of clinical trials and the changing clinical trial site practices. Together, we're going to be discovering the key issues around waste, resource consumption, life cycle analysis, consumption and waste reporting, participant considerations, challenges, and much more. I have two guests with me, and we really do hope to have a lively and frank discussion. I met one of our guests on the chairlift on a stormy and snowy day, and this was the start of an interesting discussion and interchange on weather and climate change and the environment, which moved over to clinical trials. The ride came to an end, and this discussion was left hanging as the chair went around the bowl wheel. Um, an impressive education and extensive experience in environmental projects have led this individual through swamps, challenging terrain, boardrooms, clinics, businesses, and onto expert working groups, advisory boards, academic posts, and onward to awards and recognition as a subject matter expert and environmental advocate and leader. She is described as having an ability to translate complicated environmental issues into language accessible to lay people. And here on our show today is the Dr. Shannon Bard. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks, Jane.
My other guest on the other corner of your screen is a clinical research nurse coordinator with a Bachelor of Science and RN degrees. She has extensive experience in coordinating clinical research activities, mainly in respiratory infectious disease surveillance and phase 3-4 trials, vaccine trials. And she previously worked as a research assistant. She is thrilled to join Northern Health Center for Clinical Research, NCCR, through Northern Health to build a new and exciting clinical research program in Northern BC. They opened their first clinical trial this month, and I have to say there are definitely some advantages to having everything new. So she's based in her hometown of Prince George and looks forward to working with her new team to build the processes, procedures, and professional connections required for, all that we need to do for clinical trials in the local and regional settings. Our speaker is passionate about the environment and climate change and bringing clinical research together with people of the North. She is not working all the time. She's often out riding her bike. I think you can see it in the background there. This bike is known as Orange Crush, to and from work in all weather, even snow, and walking nearby the many trails with her dogs. Please welcome my second guest, Celia Bellamore.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Ask Us, Celia and Shannon.
Thank you so much.
So excited you invited us for this topic.
I'm excited too. We've had some lovely chats, the four of us together here. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the big topic area, the big issues and the big concern, and on planetary health. And what is actually causing the problem? I'm hoping to guide that towards you, Shannon.
Absolutely. So the first thing we want to think about is what is the size of this problem? So if we look beyond clinical trials just for a moment to look at medical systems, but when we look globally, the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, so those are things like carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases which can be emitted into the atmosphere and then can cause heating to happen in the atmosphere. That contribution is estimated when the accounting is done to be about 5% in the medical system compared to the total emissions. Now to put that in some context, like what does 5% mean? 5% is the amount that is considered to be the contribution from the aviation sector. So a lot of the focus has been on how can we reduce emissions from flying, and in fact, the medical system in general has that same contribution. Now, there's lots of opportunities to reduce that. There's also lots of challenges in how we go about doing that, and there's some specific opportunities around clinical trials that we're going to get into, and Celia is going to bring to the table as well.
Okay, Celia, can you put that into a little bit more perspective for us?
So some of the stats I was looking at to get ready for this conversation, there was a very recent report came out 2025 here that is saying by 2030, there's an estimated 2 billion with a B, 2 billion people are going to have difficulties accessing food, accessing clean drinking water, and affordable housing in climates that have lower risk of climate-related disasters. So this is affecting huge numbers of people on that global scale.
Yeah, and I want to build on what Celia is saying, is that a lot of people that perhaps aren't versed in environmental science, who've sort of come newly to the environmental field, they can tend to fixate on the emissions piece. But the emissions piece is only one aspect to climate resilience, to an understanding of the changes that are happening. We're not just having warming, we're having extreme events. So extreme storm events, we're having extreme cold, extreme heat, extreme fires, flooding, a variety of different things. And if we were to only focus on the emissions, we would miss out on some of the other things that Celia has alluded to, for example, food security, transmission of vector-borne diseases, because now you're getting flooding and still water where perhaps you didn't have water before, or water that used to flow is now still, or areas where you had flowing water is now still. So you get a lot of these changes in the environment, which if those aren't taken into account, we don't understand the whole picture. And that also gets back to the natural environment and habitat and biodiversity, and many of the natural systems that the ecosystems are providing by cleaning water and cleaning air and providing sources for pharmaceuticals and providing different natural resources that are not within the accounting system of a traditional sort of capitalist model for an economy. And so we've taken those for granted in the past. And now sort of moving forward, we have to remember to account for those pieces as well, to understand that the planet doesn't need humans, but if we want, as a human population, want to live on the planet, we need clean air and clean water and access to clean food, healthy food, in a sustainable way. And so it's actually quite a big problem and quite a big issue to look at. And I encourage people to look beyond just the fixation on the emissions piece, which is a very important piece, but let us not forget about the other elements that are a part of planetary health that intersect with human health.
So that's the aim, planetary health.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let's before we dive right into the really good stuff, can you tell us if there's any key definitions or terms that we should know and understand before we get going?
Yeah, sure. So we talked a little bit about greenhouse gases and emissions. And when we talk about these emissions, when there's combustion from petroleum products to heat our homes, to drive cars, to make different products, there's carbon dioxide that's emitted. Now, methane and many other greenhouse gases can also be emitted. And methane, I wanted to emphasize its importance because it can be up to 80 times as potent as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So again, there's some complexity to these issues. Sometimes the messaging is simplified down, but it's important to understand when we're looking at solutions to really have a strong scientific basis for how we're understanding, for example, how these gases are being emitted and what their interactions are in the environment. So essentially, you can think about them, these carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions, as a kind of pollution, similar to how we would think about pollution. Often we sort of focus on pollution that's coming out as water pollution. Another thing we that may come up in the discussion is this concept of sequestration of carbon. So not only are we trying to decrease the level of emissions, so whether that's emissions, again, as we mentioned, something like fuel that's being burned either for heating or for transportation, but these emissions are also happening when we're manufacturing different products, or when we're extracting minerals and metals from mines and these other kinds of activities. So there's been some fear that there's always a time lag between when the emissions happen, they accumulate in the atmosphere, and when you reduce those emissions, and what are the levels in the atmosphere. It takes some time for the system to rebalance. And so because of this this time lag between when you could decrease the emissions, that are the new emissions that are happening, but the older emissions are still stuck in the atmosphere, what else can we do? How can we do it faster? And so there has been discussions, and there have been a number of new inventions and startup companies that have come out of universities. Actually, in Canada, some of this technology is being developed in Canada. Carbon engineering is one. Arca Climate is another, where they're actually sequestering carbon dioxide using a variety of different techniques. Arca Climate, for example, is sequestering carbon dioxide in mine tailings, where mine tailings, certain types, certain minerals exposed to air can actually transform the carbon dioxide into rock and capture it and store it in what's considered a geological, or because the time frames are so long, a permanent sort of solution. And so that is not a get out of jail free card. It's a way to accelerate the impact in combination with reducing those emissions. Another one I just wanted to mention very quickly is that there's been the term environmental footprint has been around since the 80s and 90s, and that's sort of looking at, as an individual or as an organization, what is the environmental impact of all the activities that you're looking at? And sometimes, often, environmental footprint will sort of look at what's happening now. It's sort of the current status, but you may want to look at the entire life cycle of, for example, a product, from the time that it was conceived to the time that it's produced and used by someone in the public, and then what happens with it in the end, what happens with the waste. And so there's this other term called life cycle assessment, or LCA, and these life cycle assessments will take into account not only when you bought the product and you're using it, but where did it come from and what's going to happen to it in the end, and how are there ways that it could be reused or recycled, or if it is becoming waste, what are the impacts of those wastes and how could we reduce what those impacts are. And all
We're
of
hearing
these,
we're hearing that one a lot with the clinical trials accounting of our imprint, the LCA.
absolutely, absolutely. And the
Okay.
last one that I wanted to mention, and it builds on some of the things that Celia has already mentioned, is this concept around climate resilience. And the idea of resilience is around not just being reactionary. So something bad happens and now we react to it. Can we not think more in the bigger picture of understanding these are the potential impacts of the behaviors that we have now? What can we do now to change those behaviors and change our systems so that environmental changes that may be happening in the future, we have backup plans to deal with them? And we're going to get into details of that. But that resilient piece also has a nice intersection with human health resilience and community resilience and other social aspects around sort of social determinants of health, looking at poverty, looking at homelessness, these other aspects. So again, I wanted to emphasize some of the things that both Celia and I talked about at the beginning, which is that environment shouldn't be considered something that's external to the human experience. Like, we are part of nature. We're animals. We're part of nature. We're part of the environment, and so it's around how to be resilient within that sort of ecosystem framing.
Okay, so we know what we're talking about now. Okay,
It
now
sounds like it's a lot more than just a workplace recycling
I
program.
know, and I want that term LCA to smooth off my LCA, life cycle assessment. Okay, I'm gonna make you dive in now. I want to know a little bit about some of the leading advocacy groups. I'm going to divide it into national and then closer to home. Let's start with the national and the global. What are some of the leading advocacy groups? Who are they? Maybe Celia, do you want to tell us a little?
Sure. So that was part of the stats I was looking up in those reports. And I think Reese's got a slide coming up. But the UN, who we work with all the time in clinical trials, they have a whole group. They've been running for over 10 years now, working on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And that was adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. So we're at our 10-year date. They're checking it out every year, see how we're doing. So they provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, measuring from now and into the future. And at its heart, there's 17 sustainable development goals. You can check them out with the QR code on your screen there. These are an urgent call of action to all countries, whether you're developing or a developed country, in a global partnership. They recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and our forests. The SDGs, as we call them, the Sustainable Development Goals, they build on decades of work by individual countries as well as through the UN. This program is multifaceted, and a lot of our work in clinical trials as a site do touch on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Oh, good. I'm trying to go for 4 of them here today, but I'll put the thing up later. Okay, thank you for that. And there's going to be some homework related to this. Okay, Shannon, I know there's some other big national initiative that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to just build on Celia's comment on the Sustainable Development Goals. They have areas like education and water and a number of different features. And this is often a really helpful framing for when you're thinking about, all right, if we make changes in what our operations are, where are the areas that are going to have a positive impact? And so a lot of organizations sort of frame what their social, their environmental, their health impacts are using that framework because it's an internationally recognized program. And then that allows you to see where your other partners are that also have similar values and goals. So that's one of the it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it gives you a framework to start conversations. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is that we need to change people's behaviors and change the way we're doing things if we want a different outcome than what we have now. We shouldn't expect a different outcome if we keep having the same behaviors. And for those of us that are parents, know that one of the most difficult things to do is to stimulate another human being to change their behavior. And so in any case, that UN framing can be very helpful. Another one I wanted to mention, which is within Canada, is that there's an organization which is the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment. And Dr. Melissa Lem has been leading that group for a number of years. And there's been a really exciting program that they've developed. They have a number of different initiatives involved, but they're going to be having a big announcement about a national day on October the 6th for the work that they're involved in. So, for example, one of the programs that they work on is a National Day of Action on Planetary Health. So thinking about what can people do within the medical system and the healthcare system, how can physicians and healthcare professionals sort of come together and think about what could we change in our practices that would actually be better for planetary health? And we'll be talking a little bit more as we go along about what some of the challenges are in changing the systems and how can we move forward for that. But sometimes having groups coming together and formalizing that in a day that you're actually thinking about these problems outside of your regular working day can be very helpful.
And we can all, involved in clinical trials, we can all register what we're doing at our sites for that day.
Absolutely.
That'd be great. Celia, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's happening with the Consort Spirit Group?
Yeah, so I'm
Everybody knows those
assuming,
ones.
yeah, I'm assuming most people who are with us today perhaps are familiar with Consort and Spirit. It's an international group, lots of Canadian representation. So you might be familiar with their protocol and informed consent templates. Now, they've recently announced they're working on an extension called the Reporting Guideline for Environmental Outcomes in Clinical Trials. This Consort extension is going to help authors report all the environmental impacts of a clinical trial intervention being tested in a randomized controlled trial while considering the progression of climate change. And according to the extension developers, if outcomes show no clinically significant difference, the results of the environmental outcomes could be crucial in determining which intervention is chosen. So think about all those guidelines and practices downstream that physicians are trying to change. And what if we're gathering the evidence to change it before it goes into the next guideline? So this reporting guideline project is also linked to the development of the Spirit and Consort extension for environmental outcomes in the trial protocol. So both are happening. We're changing the protocols and we're changing the reporting. So development is underway. The group plans to publish the reporting guidelines, open access, and it should be ready by about 2027.
Mm-hmm. And so some nations are already starting to require that line. So these involved in international clinical trials and MRCTs, some of your protocols will already have this trial is supports, and this is what we're doing for planetary health. So get ready for it. It's coming.
Well, can you imagine if our feasibility assessments include hey, what are they doing for the environment?
I know. And reporting. And then at the end of the trial. So even when you're reporting back to the participants and when you're reporting the clinical study report at the end, all will include environmental and planetary planetary, did I say that right? Planetary impact. Okay, Shannon, are there other national initiatives? There was one.
Yeah, there's one that I wanted to mention that CAPE, the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment, has been spearheading in collaboration with the BC Parks Foundation. So the BC Parks Foundation is a relatively new initiative that's come out of the BC government to create an endowment to help reach, I believe it's the 2030 goal to have 30% of Canada preserved as parks. And so the foundation has teamed up with Melissa. And what Melissa wanted to do was she had noticed in her practice that she was coming across individuals that were nature deficient, meaning that they were unlucky enough not to be in a circumstance to spend sufficient amounts of time in nature to benefit from the mental and physical health benefits of having physical activity in nature and being able to have the beautiful mental health ability of when you're out in nature in the forest. The Japanese call this forest bathing, maybe just taking your dog for a walk in the forest or going for a hike with your kids. But what she's decided to do is to formalize that, because there are individuals that are living in apartment buildings or in very urban environments who may have a lot of access issues to not being able to get into the environment easily. And sometimes if you have an authority figure that provides you with that incentive, that can help you create routines where you can incorporate nature into your everyday life. And so they launched this program called the Nature Prescription Program. Or the park prescription program, in which general practitioners could actually write a prescription to patients to say you're recommended to spend time in nature, to go for a walk in nature for an hour 3 times a week.
We're gonna have people following Orange Crush and Celia in the trails. And
Yeah.
I know you had
Absolutely.
the walk with the doc program too, right?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And with that
Yeah.
program, the Canadian Park Service actually offered annual subscriptions to the national parks.
There you go.
And so and so there's been a lot of publicity and excitement around that program because people can see where that benefit is. And so it's a nice way to kind of formalize for people that haven't been privileged enough to live close to nature, because if you look at the socioeconomic demographics of where people live and how healthy they are and how much wealth they have, people that tend to have more wealth also tend to be healthier. They also tend to live closer to the ocean and closer to the mountains and closer to lakes and closer to nature because they can afford to. And so this is a way, again, of addressing some of the access and equity issues.
Right. Good. Okay. I know we've been mentioning lots of resources. So, Rishi, did you want to just comment on that real quick?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. I'm adding the resources discussed in the chat as we go along. We'll also have them available for everyone through a resources slide at the end of this episode, and we'll be sending them via email as well. So no worries if you can't access it right now.
Okay. I'm gonna speed us up a little bit, and we're gonna talk about what's happening more in British Columbia here close by. Are there any local BC or Western initiatives underway? Big steps, little steps at institutions?
I can give you an example. I can give you an example of one. So again, this is thinking about not just clinical trials, but the medical system in general. And it certainly fits into clinical trials very nicely. So there's a local in Metro Vancouver, there's a local celebrity chef named Ned Bell. And his wife was sick and was hospitalized at VGH. And he noticed that the food system is decentralized and the food isn't made in-house, it's not warm when it arrives, and it wasn't particularly palatable. And he was noticing that a lot of patients weren't eating the food that was provided. If they had family members, they would bring food in, so this other food was being wasted. And if they didn't have family support, they were just not eating their food, and that potentially could have negative consequences to people recovering from surgery, for example, or going through clinical trials. And having thinking about if you're having the clinical trial and you want each individual to be having a similar environmental experience in terms of the nutrition they're
Like
getting,
our phase 1 trials, yeah.
if they're not actually consuming the same number of calories, the same number of food that's being provided, that could be a variable that might be difficult to control for. So he paired up with researchers at the University of British Columbia, Jiaying Zhao, who's a social psychologist, and also some happiness researchers, to look to see if he could design a menu that was had more vegetables in it, was lower on the food chain, so it had a lower environmental impact, so more fish and chicken and less beef and pork, and make it really delicious, all for the same price. Would there be medical outcomes that would come out of this? And what they found is that the patients ate the food. They asked if they could stay for lunch before they were discharged. They were told no, they had to be discharged in the morning. They were actually discharged with the recipes, and they found that people on average were going home 2 days earlier, which was a phenomenal savings
There you
in the
go.
system. And he was actually able to design those menus at the same price point as they were the traditional ones. So that's a really innovative way of thinking about how can we reduce the environmental footprint of one aspect of healthcare and of clinical trials, but at the same time, how do we actually make it more enjoyable? So when we're thinking about behaviors and actions that we can take around the environment, they don't have to all be around deprivation. You can't do this, you can't use that. It can also be thinking about what makes you happier. Park prescription, going into nature, having really palatable, healthy food when you're during a clinical trial or during a medical procedure. So a few things to think about.
We have another food example from the ambulatory care units in clinical trials. And there was a group called Moi Foods. I love saying that, Moi Foods. And they're these shelf-stable snacks by entrepreneur Katie Schomacher, and making a bold entrance into the food industry with that line of these nutritious snacks designed to support physical and mental wellness. And so the mission's rooted in nutritious and accessible, environmentally conscious crafted snacks for all of our healthcare partners in BC and further now. And but focusing on vulnerable populations. And so kudos to Katie. And the description of those snacks, kind of like Ned Bell's, they made me, like you look at them and you go, wow. Can you come to my house? Okay, Celia, any smaller, we talked about some big steps and we talked about some medium, is any little baby steps we can do, first steps?
So as you mentioned in my intro, I am part of a newer clinical research institute. So when everything's brand new, we get to start everything from the beginning. So we're called Northern Center for Clinical Research. It is a partnership with Northern Health Authority, UNBC, and UBC. And as part of our putting ourselves together, getting our strategic plan out, we had our mission and vision statements and our values. And one of our values that brings us towards that mission and vision that we have is interconnectedness. And what we mean by that is recognizing and cultivating all these relationships, because when we talk about environment, we're talking about relationship. So it's recognizing, cultivating relationships with each other, with our communities, and with the land. And that is baked right into us from the beginning.
I like that. Okay, so I'm sure personal commitments help as well, and not focusing on Orange Crush there, but it's learning from both you that we need the advocates and the leaders, but we need to be the ones that start it. We can't just sit around anymore waiting for someone else to do it. So kudos to everybody that's starting something new. Okay, I'm switching over into that dark side, that waste, that stuff that goes in the landfill, single-use items and packaging, big in clinical trials. So what can sponsors, institutions, and sites working in clinical trials do to reduce or maybe eliminate waste? I think there's a slide coming up here that one of you sent in. Shannon, do you want to talk about this a
Yes, I
little
can
bit?
talk about this. So this is, if you recognize this, this is a inspired by a Leonardo da Vinci anatomy classical drawing that he did with a human figure in the middle and looking at the arms and the legs and the anatomy of an individual. This is actually an image, a self-portrait of Maria Kojak, who's a Dutch artist. And a few years ago, she started doing art, a sustainable type of art, trying to look at the issues of waste that's produced in our communities. And she had a mastectomy after having breast cancer, and then had a breast reconstruction. And for that 10-hour breast reconstruction operation, she was flabbergasted by the amount of waste that was generated, especially from single-use plastics, and that 60% of the surgical instruments that were used during her operation were single-use and then disposed of. And many of them were imported. Some of them were imported from Japan, used once for one cut, and then were thrown out. So she thought to illustrate this, she would have herself in the middle of the image, and these rows and rows and rows and circles of gowns and drapes and booties for all of the waste that was generated from this operation, to illustrate how tremendous the environmental impact is with throughout our medical system. And so this is one way to get people thinking about certain decisions were made in the past for why we have things that are single use. There are reasons for that around communicable diseases and hazardous waste, but maybe we're at a time now where we might want to think about that again, because in the past we had rubber tubing, we had glass vials that were autoclaved and sterilized in-house and reused on a regular basis, and that has fallen out of practice. So this is a way to sort of start that conversation on how we could look back at what maybe historic practices were that were more sustainable, and how could we incorporate them into our current practices, and how could that also make us more climate resilient and resilient against disruptions to our supply chains, for example.
Celia, I'm going to let you take that on from a site perspective, a clinical trials site perspective. Thank
Yeah, like
you.
as clinical trial sites are busy, everybody on this call will know they are incredibly busy, and we don't directly control a lot of the vendor relationships and the purchasing and the supply management. But that purchasing piece of between us as a site or a larger institution, that is where we can have some of the biggest impact. That we're looking for those more local developed or sustainably developed items that go into our much larger ecosystem. And where our money goes is where it's going to get developed.
Good point. Okay, something just a wee more positive. Let's talk about site advocacy for reuse and recycling. I like this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was my picture. What you're looking at here is a couple of temperature controlled boxes. They're like the size of mini fridges and about the weight of those. And as many of you know, they're used to ship. It can be ambient temperature products. It can be, cold chain, that kind of stuff. So you'll see these in vaccine trials. There are all kinds of different drug trials. The awesome part about these ones, and I've removed a lot of the identifiers, this is an example of reusable shipping and logistics packaging. So, I mean, back when I started, sponsors and folks didn't want to pay to have them back. So my cooler for camping was filled with packs from these things. Nowadays, they are reusable. They get sent back to the manufacturer, or they get sent back within the sponsor's chain, and they get used. Now, the problem with this is there's competing and different manufacturers of these types of products, and they're not interchangeable. So this box might have originated in a manufacturer thousands of kilometers away. Then it goes to the sponsor's manufacturing site to get filled. It comes thousands more kilometers to get up north to me. And instead of me passing it on to, say, somebody else in our province who could use this, there's plenty of us doing this work. Because it's not interoperable, I pay the ship. They've got the paid shipping package for me. I send it back to whichever's next on the sponsors list for use. So it means it's done a whole other 1,000-kilometer thing. So if we can work on that reusing, but also the system interoperability, I think there's lots of opportunities here.
Okay, Shannon, any other quick comments on site advocacy for reuse or recycling?
Absolutely. So there have been a number of different startups coming out of universities that have medical schools, where one of the things that a number of startups have tried to, these are startup ventures, have tried to tackle is the single-use plastics. And many of them have come up against adoption issues related to, so this is trying to replace petroleum-based single-use plastics with different biologically based plastics that could be made from kelp or wood waste in sustainable manners, where the material can then be either recycled or composted. So they've been thinking about, as you mentioned before, Jane, the life cycle assessment. How can that material, rather than being end up in the landfill, can it be appropriate for either composting or reuse? But one of the big challenges that these companies in the last 10 years have run into is that logistically, under a very strained healthcare system in which nurses, the burden of having to sort and dispose of that tubing, for example, or the IV bags or the other single-use plastics is going to fall on the shoulders of the nurses. The nurses have said they don't have time to do that sorting. And so one of the things to think about is uh, we need to have good communication between the innovators that are developing these new solutions and people that are actually on the ground that are going to use them, to think creatively, not just to have this is going to be a problem, we can't adopt it, but how could you create something that could be a solution that would work in the system that would actually save time potentially for the nurses or for other people? So how can we think creatively and sort of co-develop those solutions, knowing what those problems are? And we don't have clear answers for that, but if we have more people tackling that, maybe we're more likely to have solutions.
Okay. What about our participants, the clinical trial considerations for them? Can we talk a little bit about climate vulnerability of our participants? What measures should we, as clinical trial teams, be considering, and what can we do to reduce risks, make the experience maybe safer for them, um, from a climate and environmental perspective? See, do
Yeah.
you have any?
So we live in the north.
Yeah.
And so climate and geography is an everyday consideration. Whether or not people are even going to be recruited into your trial depends for us on the condition of the roads, how bad the storms are, how bad the winter could be. Did, a windstorm take out the internet connection? Who knows? Like, there's all kinds of things we have to manage logistically. So one of the things that are happening at a global level, and we're going to have to, as a site, get into very quickly here, are around those hybrid or decentralized trials where folks, can you stay home? Can you do a lot of things locally? Why are you traveling just to see me? Some of the questions I'm asking in your follow-up visits aren't special to me. They could be asked locally and we can record them. There's a lot more technology that's come online to get access to physical measurements in the home and then have it transmitted to me. So hopefully that will reduce travel, as well as straight up risk for having our participants on those roads with, animals having to move away from their climate issues, like all kinds of stuff going on. So with that, of course, there has to be risk and management planning around it. And we're just at the ground floor starting to do this work.
Definitely starting to ask for sites to do risk management plans, and environmental content will be part of that for sure. Okay, I'm going to move us straight into the different topic of the, we already mentioned it a couple times, the challenges. From your perspectives, what are the biggest challenges, barriers, or obstacles to making a change in the way we do clinical trials for the betterment of our climate and environment?
Yeah, so maybe I can sort of address that and build on some of the things that Celia was mentioning in the previous discussion, and it's around thinking about the protocols, what's being considered, and thinking about within a trial, you want the conditions for each of the patients to be similar. However, if you haven't taken into account when you're designing your studies, environmental issues and things that are changeable that perhaps they weren't incorporated in the past because they weren't in people's faces. They weren't considering this. And I'm gonna sort of describe what I mean here. So for example, we're just coming out of the summer, and many of us have been unlucky enough to be exposed to a tremendous amount of wildfire smoke. Well, that wasn't as common, especially in urban areas, 10 years ago. And now we're seeing that certain individuals that are the very young, the very old, asthmatics, people with respiratory illnesses, those that are exposed to wildfire smoke, there are pathological consequences of that. And so, for example, if you were testing a respiratory drug and you didn't consider, how many days, what was the air quality on the days either that your control group or your group that is being trialed are being exposed to poor air quality, that could influence what your results are. So that's sort of one category that you can imagine. Another category would be, for example, heat stress. So during the heat dome, that was a mass mortality event in BC. Over 600 individuals died. We've never had anything like that happen before in BC or in Canada at that extent. They tended to be people living alone. Many people were homeless and didn't have people that were around that could advocate for them. And one of the reasons why those individuals and many were disabled as well. And one of the reasons why those individuals were particularly at risk, to think about one group, is that if you, for example, suffer from a spinal cord injury and are paralyzed, your ability to regulate your temperature is impaired. Your ability to sweat, to regulate your temperature is impaired. Your ability to detect that you're starting to fall into heat stress is also impaired. So, understanding the kind of environment that someone is living in and their ability to be able to respond, if that needs, I think, going into the future to be incorporated into the protocols. So understanding what the temperature is it unusually high or unusually low? Are there additional stresses that those patients' bodies are undergoing that are independent of the treatment of either the drug or the medical device, so that you can interpret the results afterwards? So again, we're trying to standardize what that exposure is, and there are environmental conditions that we just assumed it would be the same for everyone in a particular region or a particular area. And we're finding that there's too much variability that's happening because we're having these extreme events.
Great point. Celia, any number couple barriers, challenges, big ones?
For me, number one barrier or challenge to making that change in how we do things is going to be the budget. It's the money. And for me, budgets aren't actually about money. Budgets are the reflection of values. And those values encompass the resources, the time, and the effort that we're willing to put into things. So for me to see change in this, I need to see budget items towards, planetary health and climate sustainability.
So change additional line items.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on that, if it's not in the budget, and if it's in the budget, then it gets measured, it's quantified. And if it's not measured, it can't be managed because we don't know the quantity, we don't know how to quantify what the problem is. And so if we have a particular system that we have inherited and we're using, we need to integrate any changes we want to make into that system. New budget lines, new ways of managing it, certain quantitative goals that have to be measured. And that's the way to see some of these changes get into the system.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've incorporated most of the questions that were sent in. And so we're going to go straight over to our rapid takeaways. And this is, you all get to say 2 or 3 things that you think are the critical things you want this audience to take away from this preliminary discussion on, we're not going to solve everything today. Calls to action. Okay, so it's my last question. I'm going to start just to get started. So I get one in there. I told you there was going to be homework. It'd be great if you could all read the UN sustainability document and start incorporating as many of those practices into your workplace and clinical trials as possible. There's my number 1. How about Shannon? Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I would encourage people that want to see these changes to look for opportunities where to be open to having conversations with innovators who are coming up with solutions, but they need to talk to the people on the ground that would be using these solutions. And often that's quite challenging for scientists and engineers at universities inventing these things to find the right nurses and physicians and managers to talk to find out how are decisions made? How are these things actually used? Because the user isn't necessarily the person that made the purchasing decision. So you need people that can be translators to help them understand how within our healthcare system are these decisions made, and that's how we can see changes. So we actually need to have people that are allies and advocates for this throughout the system and find ways that they can interact and work with people who are inventing those solutions. And I just want to make a pitch for an event that happens every year called the Engineers and Scrubs Program, in which different medical problems and patient-centered problems are proposed to a group of biomedical engineers at UBC. And there have been a number of startup companies that have come out of that, including Arbutus Medical. And so that may be an opportunity if you're on the practitioner side and you've identified that there's a problem. A group such as Engineers in Scrubs during their hackathon can try to ideate to find some solutions to that.
Okay, they're all going to get inundated by all these clinical trial sites from BC sending stuff in now. All right, that's great. Okay, I'm going to skip over to Celia. Do you have a takeaway? One takeaway. I'll come back to you again. You get
On that super nitty-gritty local study coordinator within your study team level, talk about it. Literally add it to your agenda as a standing item. What are we doing towards sustainable practices? What's going well? What isn't going well? What changes can we make? And I think I've shared my template agenda with Rishi, so maybe he can share it with you all.
Oh, sweet. Okay, good. Okay, I'm back to you, Shannon. One more. Last
I would
takeaway.
say, yeah, so I would say, don't be limited by how we've always done something. Look to see if there might be a creative way to find a new solution to address some of these environmental issues, and talk to some of the older nurses and doctors to ask how things were done when they were trained. And especially if people are coming from other communities in the global south, or working in remote areas in the north where they don't have the conveniences that we have in the city, how are they dealing with some of these issues around logistics and being resilient and not being able to rely on a plane of supplies showing up every day? How are they overcoming some of these challenges, and how could we use those solutions to actually make these larger urban systems more resilient, and urban trials more resilient?
Okay, back to you, Celia. Do you have another takeaway for us?
While you're talking to people on your teams, talk to other people in your organization. Find out what they're already doing. Can you collaborate? And sometimes you might find, as my nieces like to say, you're the adultiest person in the room. You're you're the one who's going to have to lead and maybe get something going. I was looking into, there's the Canada's greenest employers. Like, can you get your employer on that list and get that little fancy title?
Oh, I like that one. Okay. I have one more, and it's there are a lot of new guidances coming out for clinical trials on environmental and climate suggested practices for sites and sponsors and protocols. And I'll post them as soon as they come out on our newsletter. But they're coming, so get ready for those. Okay, you know what? Our time is almost up. I think I could have talked to both of you for another hour easily. Um, as sustainability becomes a growing priority in healthcare and research, I think it's important to understand that environmental footprint. See, I got it in there. For clinical trials, from travel to resource use, you said waste, and more, and the path towards an eco-friendlier future through evidence-informed practices. That's what I got out of this. We've been inspired by new initiatives. Wow, we have a lot of resources up there, Rishi, and at the local, national, and the international levels. And I think we're all going to be together on this learning path in implementing environmentally responsible clinical trials. So good environmental practices for all, and it's going to start with us, and starting with Celia's agenda. Okay, I'd like to thank my guests today, Shannon and Celia. Your time and your expertise and your insight and enlightenment for me and everybody listening on today's topic was wonderful. I hope you enjoyed being here.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for having
We
us.
really enjoyed having you here. Thank you to our viewing audience and for your attendance and participation today. The questions you sent in were fantastic, and they're the best questions I've seen in 17 years of doing the show. And special thank you again to our returning producer, Rishi Sani, who's in his 4th season as our producer. And Rishi's going to highlight some resources available for this session, our upcoming events, and provide you with some contact information and how to get your evaluation certificates. Over to you, Rishi.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Shannon and Celia. That was an awesome presentation. I have such a personal interest in this topic, so this was really, really informative for me. So just thank you. Quickly, everyone, you can see the resources here that we discussed during this episode. There's some links there if anyone wants to access them through the chat as well. But again, don't worry, we'll be sending them in a post-event email as well to you. And speaking of which, this presentation meets the UN Sustainable Development Goal for number 3, which is good health and well-being, and 4 for quality education. We do really encourage everyone to read that document as well, as Jean mentioned. And several of our speakers here today are working on industry and infrastructure, which are number 9 and number 11 issues in sustainable cities and communities. So hopefully we can all work together to make the change we need to now. As mentioned, there will be a post-event email that I send to everyone. In that email, you can request a certificate of attendance. This event is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education units. If you do request a certificate of attendance, you self-attest of attending for the full hour. And we do always encourage you to complete these surveys as they do help us inform our educational content and delivery. Quickly, for future events, we ask everyone to save the date as on November 25th, 2025, and our lunch hour, 12 to 1, we will be doing a presentation on WHO Global Competency Framework. This presentation will be done by Jean hosting this, and this will be on looking over the modern framework for the global competency for clinical research. And this will list all the competencies that could be demonstrated by an entire research team to carry out a successful study. So again, we please do ask that you save the date there. The promotion will be going out in a newsletter shortly. If you want to watch any of our previous Ask Us episodes, you can always use that QR code right there to see our resource library. This episode will likely be added to the library as well shortly later today. And Shannon mentioned this one, and we do want to encourage everyone to please scan that QR code and see the link that will be in your email shortly later today. This is the National Day of Action on Planetary Health. That is October 6th, 2025. This is led by CAPE, which Shannon mentioned, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And it's supported by the healthcare leaders and organizations across the country. This is the first of its kind, and there are 3 key areas of priorities to address, which are the increase the resourcing, ambition, and coordination of the federal government's Climate and Health Secretariat, support a national center for education on planetary health, and protect healthcare systems across Canada by ensuring the health and economic costs of pollution are addressed. And lastly, we always encourage everyone to connect with us on our various social medias. And if you haven't been inundated with so many QR codes as well already, there's one more to subscribe to our newsletter right there. And I'll hand it back to you, Jean.
Okay, so this was our first episode for season 6 web show version of Ask Us, and previous episodes and series are posted in our Clinical Trials BC website for viewing. We hope to see you at the next Ask Us later this fall, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.